Jada stared down the barrel of a silenced pistol, the takeout bag in her hand trembling just enough to betray her fear. She was 1 second away from becoming a loose end in a mob hit, but the man holding the gun didn't pull the trigger. Instead, the terrified silence of the penthouse was shattered by a sound that made the ruthless kingpin freeze, the voice of his son, who hadn't spoken a single word since his mother died. "Mommy," the toddler whispered, reaching his small hands toward Jada. "She smells like Mommy." Jada's feet throbbed in her damp sneakers, every step of the late-night shift a reminder of the overdue rent waiting on her kitchen counter. The private elevator hummed smoothly, whisking her up to the penthouse, but when the gold-plated doors slid open, the atmosphere shifted instantly from quiet luxury to lethal tension. Jinwoo Choi stood in the center of the room, his tailored suit jacket discarded to reveal dark ink coiling up his neck, a gun leveled directly at her chest. The air was heavy, suffocating under the weight of his stare. While instinct screamed at her to run, Jada remained rooted to the spot, her eyes drawn not to the weapon, but to the distress on the face of the small boy clinging to Jinwoo's leg. She didn't belong in this world of high-stakes crime, yet she refused to beg. She simply raised her chin, her presence filling the room with a scent of vanilla and rain. That familiar scent drifted toward the child, and in a moment that defied all logic, the killer lowered his weapon, and the hierarchy of power crumbled before a mourning father's desperate hope. The heavy steel doors of the elevator didn't open. Instead, a sharp electronic beep signaled the deadlock engaging, sealing the penthouse from the outside world. Jada spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs, only to find Jinwoo Choi holstering his weapon with a terrifying casualness. He tapped a command into a wall panel, and steel shutters began to descend over the floor-to-ceiling windows, blocking out the rain-streaked skyline of the city. "What are you doing?" Jada's voice trembled, though she fought to keep her chin high. "I delivered the food. Let me go." Jinwoo ignored her plea, walking past her to place a hand on his son's head. Minho was silent again, burying his face in the expensive fabric of his father's trousers, but his small hand was reaching out, fingers grasping at the air in Jada's direction. Jinwoo watched the movement, his dark eyes unreadable. "You can't leave," he said, the statement flat and absolute. "Not yet." "This is kidnapping," Jada snapped, her fear sparking into anger. She took a step back, clutching her delivery bag like a shield. "I don't know who you are, and I don't want to know. Just open the door." Jinwoo turned slowly, the tattoos on his neck shifting with the movement of muscle. He looked at her not as a woman, but as a tactical asset he needed to secure. "My son hasn't spoken in 365 days. Not a word. Not a sound. Until you walked in." He took a step closer, invading her personal space with the scent of expensive cologne and gunpowder. "Make him do it again." Jada blinked, the absurdity of the demand hitting her. "I didn't do anything. He just liked my lotion." "Then stay," Jinwoo commanded. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a thick money clip. He didn't count the bills, he simply tossed the entire stack onto the glass coffee table. It landed with a heavy thud. 10,000. For tonight. Just sit with him. Let him hear your voice. Jada looked at the money. It was more than she made in 6 months of double shifts. It was the rent, the overdue electric bill, and the freedom from the crushing anxiety that woke her up every morning at 4 a.m. She looked at the gun now resting on the sideboard, then at the terrified, hopeful eyes of the little boy. She was terrified of the man in the suit, but she was just as terrified of the eviction notice waiting in her mailbox. One night, Jada whispered, her voice steadying. "I stay for one night. And you keep that gun locked away." Jinwoo nodded once, a sharp, curt motion. "One night," he agreed. "Welcome to the cage, Ms. Thompson." The penthouse felt less like a home and more like a museum, cold, pristine, and terrifyingly silent. Jada sat on the edge of the sprawling leather sofa, her muscles coiled tight, ready to bolt at the slightest provocation. Minho stood 3 feet away, clutching a toy robot with white-knuckled intensity, his dark eyes locked on her face. Jinwoo had retreated to the shadows of the hallway, a silent sentinel leaning against the wall, watching. The distance did little to dampen the threat he radiated, but Jada forced herself to ignore him. She looked at her dry, trembling hands and reached into her pocket for the small, battered tube of lotion she carried everywhere. She squeezed a dollop onto her palm and began to rub it in. The rich, warm scent of vanilla and raw shea butter wafted through the sterile air, cutting through the metallic tang of fear. Minho's nose twitched. He took a hesitant step forward, then another. "It's the lotion, isn't it?" Jada whispered, realization dawning on her. It wasn't her face or her voice that had drawn him in, it was this simple, drugstore scent. It was a memory trapped in a bottle. "Your mama used this too." Minho didn't answer, but he climbed onto the sofa, crawling until he was curled into her side, burying his face in the crook of her arm. He inhaled deeply, his small body shuddering as the tension left him. Jada froze for a moment, unsure, before instinct took over. She wrapped her arm around him, rocking him gently. The boy was exhausted, his eyes red-rimmed from crying, but for the first time since she arrived, the tears had stopped. "Hush now," she murmured, the melody rising instinctively from her chest. It was a song her grandmother used to hum, a slow, soulful rhythm meant to chase away bad dreams. Her voice was low and smoky, filling the empty spaces of the room. "Sleep now, little one. You're safe." Minho's breathing evened out. His grip on the robot loosened. Within minutes, the boy who hadn't slept through the night in a year was dead to the world, slumped heavily against the delivery girl's chest. Jada looked up and found Jinwoo standing in the doorway. He hadn't moved. The shadows of the hall obscured his face, but the light caught the hard line of his jaw and the dark ink spiraling up his neck. He looked at the sleeping boy, then at Jada, with an expression that terrified her more than the gun had. It wasn't anger. It was a hunger, a desperate, starving look of a man watching a miracle he didn't believe he deserved. The air between them was thick with unsaid words, a strange cocktail of vanilla sweetness and the lingering, sharp scent of gunpowder. For the first time that night, Jinwoo lowered his guard, looking less like a kingpin and more like a man haunting his own life. Sunlight sliced through the gaps in the steel shutters, illuminating the manila folder sliding across the marble countertop. Jada stared at the document, sleep still clinging to her eyes, until the bold black letters jolted her awake. Paid in full. Her student loans, the credit card maxed out on car repairs, the 3 months of back rent. All zeroed out. She looked up, fury rising in her chest to match the thrumming of her pulse. Jinwoo stood on the other side of the kitchen island, sipping espresso, looking infuriatingly composed. "You had no right," Jada hissed, shoving the papers back. "I didn't ask for charity. I don't want your blood money. It's not charity." "It's a retainer," Jinwoo said, his voice smooth and devoid of apology. "I don't let strangers around my son without knowing their history." "You're clean, Jada." Desperate, struggling, but clean. He set his cup down, the porcelain clinking softly against the stone. "I want you to stay. Permanently." He slid a second document toward her. A contract. The salary figure at the bottom was enough to buy a house in the suburbs with cash. But the terms were clear: live in. Absolute discretion. No outside visitors. "I'm not a prisoner, and I'm not a pet you can buy just because you cleared my tab," Jada said, ignoring the contract. She leaned over the counter, invading his space, fueled by a pride that poverty hadn't managed to break. "I have a life. I have friends. If you think I'm going to lock myself in this tower and wait for you to tell me when to breathe, you're out of your mind." Jinwoo's eyes narrowed, but he didn't back away. He leaned in, mirroring her posture until they were inches apart. The air between them crackled, charged with the friction of two immovable forces colliding. "My world is dangerous. Coming and going puts a target on your back. People will ask questions. Then I'll take my chances," she challenged, her gaze holding his without flinching. "I go home when I want. I have my own days off. Or I walk out right now and you can explain to Minho why that mommy smell is gone." The silence stretched, taut as a tripwire. Jinwoo studied her, his gaze dropping to her lips for a fraction of a second before snapping back to her eyes. He wasn't used to defiance, he was used to obedience, fear, and submission. But as he looked at the fire in her eyes, something flickered behind his cold mask: respect, perhaps, or something far more volatile. "You are stubborn," he muttered, the ghost of a smirk touching the corner of his mouth. "I'm expensive," she corrected, tapping the salary figure. "And I'm free. Take it or leave it." Jinwoo straightened, the buttons of his vest straining slightly across his chest. "Fine. You leave during the day. But you are back before sunset. Every night." He extended a hand, large and rough with calluses. "Deal." Jada hesitated, looking at the hand that had held a gun hours ago. She took it. His grip was warm, electric, and terrifyingly strong. "Deal." The kitchen, usually as sterile and silent as an operating room, was currently under siege. Jada moved between the 6-burner stove and the marble island with a chaotic rhythm that made the security detail nervous. They were used to silence, takeout boxes, and efficiency. They weren't used to the sizzling roar of a deep fryer or the thick, savory aroma of garlic, sesame oil, and smoked paprika drifting through the vents. Jada pointed a flour-dusted spoon at the largest guard, a man whose neck was wider than her head. "Stop hovering by the door and grab those plates. If you want to eat, you work." The guard blinked, looking toward Jinwoo's office for instruction, but found none. Tentatively, he holstered his weapon's safety strap and reached for the stack of porcelain. Jinwoo entered the room moments later, drawn by the smell. He stopped dead in the doorway. His dining table, a slab of black obsidian that had never hosted anything warmer than a glass of scotch, was laden with a feast that defied categorization. There was southern fried chicken, golden and crisp, but tossed in a sticky, spicy gochujang glaze. Beside it sat a pot of slow-simmered collard greens next to bowls of sharp, fermented kimchi and steamed rice. "What is all this?" Jinwoo asked, eyeing the spread suspiciously. "It's called dinner," Jada said, untying her apron. "Soul food meets soul food. Figured since we're stuck in this fortress, we might as well eat like people, not robots." She pulled out a chair for Minho, who scrambled up, eyeing the chicken with wide, curious eyes. Jada didn't wait for permission. She plated food for the boy, then looked at Jinwoo and his men. "Well? Sit." The guards hesitated until Jinwoo gave a subtle nod. The meal began in stiff silence, the only sounds the clinking of silverware. But the food was undeniable. The crunch of the chicken, the heat of the peppers, the comfort of the greens, it broke down defenses that bullets couldn't penetrate. Shoulders dropped. The large guard let out a low noise of appreciation that sounded suspiciously like a moan. Then, disaster struck, or so it seemed. Minho, trying to maneuver a large drumstick, slipped. The sticky, red sauce chicken flew from his grip, bouncing off his chest and landing with a wet splat right onto Jada's cheek. The room froze. The guard stopped chewing. Jinwoo stiffened, his eyes darting to Jada, waiting for the anger, the scolding, the noise. Instead, Jada crossed her eyes, looking at the sauce dripping down her nose, and puffed out her cheeks. Minho's eyes went wide. Then, a sound erupted from his small chest, a rusty, hiccuping giggle that quickly spiraled into a full, bell-bright laugh. It was a sound pure enough to shatter glass. Jada wiped the sauce away, grinning, but her eyes locked on Jinwoo. The mob boss sat motionless, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth, staring at his laughing son as if he were witnessing a resurrection. The darkness in his eyes didn't disappear, but for the first time, the light in the room was bright enough to push it back. The silence of the penthouse at 2 a.m. was heavier than the steel shutters blocking the windows. Jada, unable to sleep, wandered into the hallway seeking a glass of water, but a sliver of light spilling from the master bathroom stopped her cold. Through the cracked door, she saw Jinwoo sitting on the edge of the marble tub, his shirt discarded on the floor, struggling to angle a strip of gauze over a jagged gash on his ribs. She didn't knock. She simply pushed the door open, the sudden movement making Jinwoo flinch, his hand drifting instinctively toward the gun resting on the sink. When he saw it was her, his shoulders dropped, though his expression remained guarded. "You're bleeding," Jada said, her voice soft but firm in the tiled echo of the room. "It's nothing." "A disagreement at the docks," Jinwoo muttered, wincing as he tried to secure the tape. "Go back to bed." Jada ignored him. She crossed the room, taking the gauze from his blood-slicked fingers. Sit still, she ordered, dropping to her knees between his legs to get a better angle. For a moment, he tensed, unused to being touched with anything other than violence, but he didn't stop her. As she cleaned the wound, the smell of antiseptic mixing with the iron scent of blood, Jada's eyes wandered over the canvas of his skin. Without the suit, he was terrifyingly beautiful. Dark, intricate ink swirled across his chest and up his neck, a tapestry of myths and warnings. A roaring tiger clawed its way over his shoulder, a symbol of protection and power in Korean folklore. But it was the quieter ink that caught her attention. Her fingers brushed against a faded character inked directly over his heart, surrounded by falling camellia petals. "What does this one mean?" she whispered, her hand hovering over the scar tissue. Jinwoo looked down, his gaze heavy. "It is Han," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "It means a sorrow and resentment that never fades. A grief you carry until you die." He paused, the silence stretching taut. "It is for Minho's mother." Jada's hand stilled against his warm skin. She looked up, finding him watching her with an intensity that stole the air from her lungs. Beneath the monster the world saw, there was a man crushed by the weight of his own ghosts. "And the tiger?" she asked, needing to break the heavy spell of his grief. "The burden of the clan." "To protect what remains," he murmured. He leaned forward slightly, closing the distance between them. The movement shifted the dynamic in the room instantly. The antiseptic clinical nature of the moment evaporated, replaced by a humid, electric awareness. Jada became acutely aware of the heat radiating from his chest, the breadth of his shoulders, and the way his dark eyes traced the line of her throat. For a heartbeat, neither moved. The air crackled, the line between employer and employee blurring into something dangerous and undeniable. "You have steady hands, Jada," he whispered, the sound vibrating through her. It wasn't a compliment. It felt like a confession. Sunlight was a foreign concept in the Choi penthouse, filtered through tinted glass and steel shutters. Jada couldn't take it anymore. Minho looked pale, a little ghost haunting his own playroom. Against the strict protocols in her contract, she bundled him into his coat and slipped out the service entrance, heading for the small, gated park 3 blocks away. For 20 minutes, it was perfect. Minho chased pigeons, his laughter bubbling up into the crisp autumn air. Jada sat on a bench, watching him, feeling the tension of the last few weeks loosen in her shoulders. She closed her eyes, tilting her face toward the sun. When she opened them, the world had shifted. The birds had stopped singing. The hair on her arm stood up, a primal warning system flaring to life. She looked down at her navy uniform. A small, unblinking red dot danced over her heart. She froze. Her breath caught in her throat. Before she could scream, before she could even lunge for Minho, a sharp crack echoed from the rooftops above, followed instantly by the sound of a body hitting the pavement behind the park hedges. Tires screeched. 3 black SUVs mounted the curb, tearing through the park's fence. Jinwoo burst from the lead vehicle, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He didn't speak. He scooped Minho up with one arm and grabbed Jada by the back of her jacket with the other, hurling them into the back seat before the car was even fully stopped. The ride back was a blur of speed and silence. When they reached the penthouse, Jinwoo dragged Jada into the living room, throwing her away from him as if her touch burned. "Are you insane?" he roared, his voice cracking. The composure of the crime lord was gone. This was a man who had just watched his nightmare replay itself. "I told you never to leave." Never. He needed fresh air. "He's a child, Jinwoo, not a prisoner." Jada yelled back, though her hands were shaking violently. "We were fine until you were dead." Jinwoo cut her off, slamming his hand against the wall. "You had a laser on your chest, Jada. 1 second. That is the difference between you breathing and you being a corpse on the sidewalk." He paced the room, running a hand through his hair, his chest heaving. "I have snipers on the roofs because I know they are coming. You do not know. You know nothing." He stopped pacing and looked at her. His eyes were wild, desperate. "Pack your things." Jada blinked. "What?" "Get out," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. He pulled his wallet out, throwing cash onto the floor. Take it. Go back to your delivery bike. Go back to being invisible. You're fired. You can't just. I am saving your life, he shouted, the raw emotion shattering his control. Because I cannot watch another woman I care about die in front of my son. Go. The bills lay scattered across the polished marble floor like dead leaves, a fortune in hush money that Jada didn't even glance at. She stood her ground, her sneakers planted firmly amidst the cash, her hands balled into fists at her sides. No, she said. The word was quiet, but it hit the walls of the penthouse with the force of a gunshot. Jinwoo spun around, his eyes wide with disbelief and rage. Did you not hear me? I said get out. I will have the driver take you anywhere. Another state. Another country. Just go. I heard you, Jada stepped forward, crushing a $100 bill under her heel. I'm just not listening. You don't get to do that, Jinwoo. You don't get to drag me into this world, let me fall in love with that little boy, and then throw me out like trash because you are having a panic attack. I am not having a panic attack. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides, grabbing her by the shoulders. His grip was hard, bruising, the desperation of a man watching a train wreck in slow motion. I am trying to keep you breathing. They will kill you, Jada. They will use you to get to me, and his voice broke, the terrifying mask of the Mafia boss crumbling to reveal the terrified husband beneath. I cannot bury you too. I can't. Then don't. Jada didn't pull away. Instead, she reached up, her hands gripping the lapels of his suit jacket, yanking him down until their faces were inches apart. I'm a grown woman. I survived the streets and the system long before I met you. I know what a gun looks like. I know the risks. But you don't get to decide what I'm afraid of. Jinwoo stared at her, his chest heaving, the adrenaline from the sniper attack still coursing through his veins like battery acid. He looked for fear in her eyes and found only fire. I'm not afraid of them, she whispered, her voice fierce and trembling. I'm afraid of walking out that door. I'm afraid of leaving him. I'm afraid of leaving you. The admission hung in the charged air between them, heavy and undeniable. Jinwoo opened his mouth to argue, to push her away one last time for her own good, but Jada didn't let him. She surged upward, crashing her lips against his. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It tasted of fear, adrenaline, and sharp, desperate need. Jinwoo froze for a fraction of a second, stunned, before his resolve shattered completely. He made a low sound in his throat and wrapped his arms around her waist, lifting her off the floor and crushing her against him. He kissed her back with a starving intensity, devouring her refusal to leave. In that chaotic, heated embrace, the employer-employee line didn't just blur, it was obliterated. She wasn't leaving. And God help anyone who tried to make her. The kiss ended not with a gentle pulling away, but with a concussive boom that shook the very foundation of the building. The private elevator doors, reinforced steel meant to stop bullets, buckled inward with a groan of tortured metal. Smoke billowed into the pristine living room, acrid and thick. Jinwoo shifted instantly. The lover vanished, the warlord returned. He shoved Jada toward the hallway, reaching into the waistband of his trousers to pull a spare Glock. He pressed the cold steel into her palm, his grip bruising. Safety is off, he commanded, his voice cutting through the ringing in her ears. Go to Minho. Lock the door. Shoot anything that isn't me. Jinwoo. Go, he roared, turning back toward the smoke. He didn't look back. He raised his own weapon and advanced into the haze, a demon walking willingly into hell. Jada didn't freeze. She ran. She scrambled down the hallway, her socks slipping on the polished wood, bursting into the nursery where Minho sat frozen in his bed, clutching the sheets. She grabbed him, dragging him behind the heavy oak dresser, and then shoved a bookshelf against the door. Outside, the penthouse erupted into a war zone. The sound of gunfire was deafening, a chaotic rhythm of automatic fire and the distinct, rhythmic cracks of Jinwoo's pistol. She heard shouting in Korean, screams of pain, and the sickening crunch of bodies hitting walls. Minho was trembling violently, his mouth open in a silent scream. Jada pressed his face into her chest, covering his ears with one hand, leveling the heavy gun at the door with the other. "It's okay," she lied, tears streaming down her face. "I've got you." The doorknob turned. Jada stopped breathing. The bookshelf rattled. Then, a boot kicked the wood, splintering the frame. The barricade gave way with a crash, and a man in a black tactical vest stumbled in, blood on his face, a knife raised in his hand. He wasn't Jin Woo. He saw them instantly. A sneer curled his lip as he lunged toward the corner, toward the boy. Jada didn't think. She didn't hesitate. She didn't remember the safety off or the warnings. She just squeezed. The gun bucked in her hand, the recoil jarring her shoulder. The explosion was deafening in the small room. The man jerked backward as if yanked by an invisible wire, a bloom of red erupting on his chest. He collapsed heavily onto the rug, twitching once before going still. Silence rushed back into the room, broken only by the ringing in her ears. Jada stared at the body, her hand shaking so hard the gun rattled against the floor. She had taken a life. But as she felt Minho's small heartbeat fluttering against her ribs, she knew she would do it again. She pulled the boy closer, the smell of gunpowder drowning out the vanilla. The sirens that wailed in the distance didn't signal an arrest, they signaled the cleanup crew. Uniformed officers swarmed the penthouse, but they didn't draw weapons on Jin Woo. Instead, they moved with practiced efficiency, stepping over bodies and beginning the grim work of erasing the night's violence. Jin Woo didn't watch them. He stumbled down the hallway, his suit torn and stained with blood that wasn't his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He reached the nursery door, his breath catching in his throat at the sight of the splintered wood and the lifeless body on the rug. "Jada?" She was huddled in the corner, still clutching Minho, the gun resting loosely in her trembling hand. She looked up, her eyes wide and dark with shock, but alive. Unharmed. Jin Woo crossed the room in 2 strides. He gently pried the weapon from her fingers, setting it aside before collapsing to his knees. He didn't care about the blood on his trousers or the men watching from the hallway. He bowed his head, pressing his forehead against Jada's hands, which were still wrapped around their son. It wasn't a gesture of defeat, it was an act of absolute reverence. She hadn't just watched his back, she had saved his heart. "You stayed," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You stayed." Jada let out a shaky breath, leaning her forehead against his. "I told you," she murmured, tears finally spilling over. "I'm not going anywhere." 2 years later, the scent of gunpowder had been replaced by the fragrance of cherry blossoms and soul food. The garden of the new estate, far away from the city skyline, was packed with guests. It was a scene of beautiful contradictions. Hardened men in dark suits sat next to Jada's crying aunts from Detroit. Tables held bottles of soju alongside pitchers of sweet tea. Jada stood at the end of the aisle, her white gown flowing around her like water, holding a bouquet of hibiscus and mugwort. Jin Woo waited at the altar, looking devastatingly handsome, his dark eyes soft and entirely focused on her. He no longer looked like a man hunted by ghosts, he looked like a man who had found his home. But the star of the show wasn't the bride or the groom. "Come on, Appa! Kiss her already!" The shout rang out across the garden, loud, clear, and full of mischievous joy. Minho, now 5 years old and wearing a miniature tuxedo, stood between them holding the rings. He tugged on Jin Woo's jacket, impatient. The crowd erupted in laughter. Jin Woo grinned, a true, unburdened smile, and looked down at his son, then back at his wife. "You heard the boss," Jin Woo said, pulling Jada close. As he kissed her, the applause rose into the sky, drowning out the silence of the past forever.